Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into the desert sands of ancient Egypt, a time when gods were believed to walk among men and stone could hold eternity. This story is about Khafre, the pharaoh who built the Sphinx, a monument that still stares into the rising sun after 4,500 years. We'll explore his world, his dreams, and the mystery that connects a man to a creature of stone. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. The air around Giza is always heavy with silence, as if the earth itself remembers the sound of chisels striking limestone. The Great Pyramid of Khufu rises like a mountain carved by human hands. But not far from its shadow stands another pyramid, smaller, yet more refined, its limestone once gleaming white beneath the morning light. This is the Pyramid of Khafre, the son of Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops and to the Egyptians as Khafre. His reign marked one of the most stable and magnificent periods in the Old Kingdom. Beneath the blazing sun, he ordered the creation of monuments so enduring that they would outlast the empire itself. Khafre's Egypt was not a place of chaos, but of balance. A kingdom obsessed with harmony between earth and heaven. The Nile carried life through the desert, its cycles of flood and retreat shaping the rhythm of every household, every temple, every god. Farmers trusted the river as priests trusted the stars. And above them all, Pharaoh was the bridge, the living Horus, whose heart and will kept the cosmos from falling apart. To understand Khafre, we must first understand the world that shaped him. He was born into divine expectation. His father, Khufu, had already achieved the impossible, a pyramid so vast that even time bowed before it. The boy grew up in its shadow, seeing the endless caravans of stone, the workers singing as they pulled sledges through the sand, the high priests marking stars across the night sky to keep the pyramid aligned with Orion's belt. For a child, this was not just construction, it was creation itself. Every block that rose was a prayer, every measurement a dialogue with the gods. Khafre's early years were filled with this sacred rhythm of labour and devotion. He watched his father's architects, mathematicians and priests work together as if guided by a single invisible hand. He learned that stone could outlive breath, that power was not shouted but built, quietly, layer upon layer, into something eternal. Yet even as a boy, he must have felt the weight of legacy pressing on his shoulders. How could anyone surpass Khufu? The Great Pyramid was not just a tomb, it was perfection, a mountain of geometry and faith. But Khafre's eyes, they say, were not filled with envy. He looked toward the horizon where the desert met the sky, and dreamed of something different. Not taller, but wiser. Not grander, but more alive. The Egypt of his youth was golden. Trade routes stretched far into Nubia and the Levant. The temples of Ra gleamed with gold leaf, their columns painted in brilliant reds and blues. The priests spoke of order, ma'at, the sacred balance of truth, justice, and cosmic harmony. And Khafre, still a prince, listened. He learned that ma'at was not something to be built, but something to be lived. As he grew older, the court began to change. His brother, Khafre, ruled for a short time after Khufu's death. Some say Khafre envied their father's glory and sought to claim it for himself by building his pyramid at Abu Rawash, far from Giza. Others whisper that there was conflict, a quiet war of lineage and pride. When Khafre's reign ended abruptly, Khafre ascended the throne. He was no longer the boy who watched the stones rise. He was the pharaoh, the living god on earth. And somewhere, in the midst of the desert winds and royal decrees, an idea began to take shape in his mind. An idea that would become the great Sphinx. A guardian, carved not from blocks but from the living bedrock of Giza itself. A creature that would face the dawn forever, reminding the world that the soul of a king never truly sleeps. The reign of Khafre began beneath the calm breath of the Nile. Egypt in his time was a kingdom wrapped in golden silence. a land so confident in its order that even the river seemed to flow according to the king's will. The people believed the gods watched over every sunrise, every harvest, and that Pharaoh himself was the voice of those gods upon earth. To rule Egypt was to balance heaven and dust, and Khafre carried that balance with the calm certainty of a man born for it. Giza had already become sacred ground. His father's pyramid pierced the sky like the axes of the world, and priests said it was a stairway for the soul of Khufu to climb toward the stars. When Khafre took the throne, he did not seek to rival that greatness in size, but in harmony. He ordered his architects to design a pyramid that would align perfectly with his father's, as if father and son might speak through eternity. Together, their monuments formed a dialogue in stone, two hearts of the same dynasty beating on the desert's edge. The early years of his reign were marked by prosperity. Caravans came from far lands, ebony and ivory from Nubia, lapis from the mountains of Afghanistan, cedar from Byblos. The storerooms of Memphis overflowed with grain, linen and copper. The scribes recorded the wealth of the kingdom in steady hands, and priests offered incense to thank the gods for balance. Khafre was no conqueror. His power lay not in war, but in the ability to keep peace so perfect that it felt eternal. Each morning, he would walk to the edge of the royal enclosure and look toward the horizon. To him, the desert was not empty. It was alive, breathing with secrets. The soft dunes, the slow crawl of shadow and light, the distant shimmer of heat, all spoke to him of eternity. He saw in them something divine, something that could never die. And perhaps that is why the idea of the Sphinx began to whisper in his heart. The vision of a guardian that would capture that silent power in form. The workers who built his pyramid were not slaves, as later myths would tell, but skilled labourers, organised in crews with names like the Drunkards of Menkaure and the Friends of Khafre. They lived in vast workers' villages with bakeries, breweries and medical quarters. They sang while they worked, their chants rising into the hot air like prayers. Each block they moved, some weighing more than 40 tons, was placed with devotion and precision, a gesture of faith in their king's divinity. Khafre's architects studied the stars as carefully as they studied the stones. The alignment of the pyramid with the celestial north was near perfect, a symbol that the pharaoh's soul would remain forever fixed in the cosmic order. The base measured 215 meters on each side. The angle of ascent was steep but graceful, reflecting the ideal proportions of the heavens themselves. When it was complete, the outer casing of fine Tura limestone gleamed like sunlight made solid. From miles away, travellers could see it glitter at dawn, as if the horizon itself had been cut open to reveal gold. Yet for all its majesty, Khafre's pyramid was not his most mysterious creation. Beneath its gaze, carved directly from the living bedrock, would rise something unlike anything before or since, a creature of power and silence. The pharaoh had seen enough monuments to the dead. What he sought was a monument to watch the living. And so, as the seasons passed and the Nile rose again, the first plans for the great Sphinx began to form, not on papyrus, but in the imagination of a man who believed that stone could dream. Khafre's story begins within a dynasty of giants. The fourth dynasty of Egypt was unlike any that came before or after, a line of rulers who believed themselves carved from the same substance as the gods. His grandfather, Sneferu, had mastered the science of pyramid building. His father, Khufu, turned that mastery into immortality. His brother, Jedefre, tried to reshape tradition. And then came Khafre, the quiet heir who would give Egypt a face that would never fade. He was born into the palace at Memphis, near the life-giving curve of the Nile. The court around him was alive with ceremony. Musicians, dancers, priests, scribes, and guards. The scent of myrrh and lotus flowers drifted through the corridors. Every wall was painted with stories of gods and kings, every room filled with the hum of power. To be royal in those years was to be a symbol, not a man. From the moment Khafre could walk, he was treated as a living image of Horus, destined to uphold the divine balance. Khufu's reign cast a shadow so vast that even the sun seemed to bow before it. He was both feared and worshipped. Some said he spoke with the gods directly. Others whispered that he had angered them with his pride. But to Khafre, he was a teacher, stern, distant, and eternal. The boy watched as his father commanded entire mountains to move, as tens of thousands laboured with quiet devotion, and as the Great Pyramid slowly rose from the desert like a thought made real. It was the first and greatest lesson in what it meant to rule Egypt: patience, precision, and faith. When Khufu died, the court trembled. Power was like the Nile, always flowing, always seeking a new course. Jedefre, Khafre's elder brother, took the throne. Some chronicles praise him as wise, others suggest deceit. It is said he sought to break from tradition, moving his pyramid away from Giza to Abu Rawash, wanting his legacy to stand apart. Perhaps he feared his father's monument would forever outshine his own. During Jedefre's short reign, Khafre waited in the silence of observance. He did not rebel or scheme. He watched. He learned. He saw how ambition could divide a family, how even royal blood could turn to rivalry. The lessons of his brother's pride became warnings carved into his heart. When Jedefre's rule ended, through reasons still unknown, Khafre's path opened not by violence, but by inevitability. The people welcomed him as a restorer of order, a continuation of what had been lost. His coronation took place under the open sky. The priests anointed him with sacred oils. The golden crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was placed upon his head. Trumpets echoed across the courtyard as the high priest declared him Horus, Lord of the Two Lands. In that moment, Khafre was no longer the son of a god. He became one. But power in Egypt was never only about the throne. It was about balance, between the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. Khafre understood this better than most. He had witnessed the fragility of dynasties, the rise and fall of trust within his own bloodline. So he vowed to rule not with the hunger for glory, but with the stillness of stone. The years ahead would test that promise. The world would know him not through wars or decrees, but through monuments that breathed in silence. And in that silence the dream of the Sphinx was waiting. Half man, half lion, and wholly eternal. Before he became Pharaoh, Khafre was a child of the desert. His earliest memories were filled with the rhythm of hammers against limestone, the shouts of overseers echoing through the dry air, and the endless shimmer of sunlight over half-carved blocks. He grew up near the construction of his father's pyramid, a living witness to the birth of one of the world's greatest wonders. For him, the vast plateau of Giza was a playground and a classroom. From the steps of the royal camp he could see thousands of men at work. Craftsmen, masons, water carriers, scribes marking every layer of progress on clay tablets. The sight was hypnotic. Rows of men dragging sledges through wet sand, ropes creaking, drums beating to keep the rhythm steady. To Khafre it was not labour, it was ceremony. Each movement felt sacred, as though the very act of building connected man to eternity. The boy listened to the priests who guided the alignment of the pyramid by the stars. They explained that when the corners faced true north, south, east, and west, the soul of the king would rise to the heavens unbroken. He looked up at the night sky, where Orion shimmered above the desert, and tried to imagine what it meant for a man to become a constellation. These thoughts shaped him more deeply than any royal tutor could. He learned patience from the masons, humility from the desert, and purpose from the stones themselves. When the workers rested, Khafre would wander among the unfinished corridors, touching the cool surfaces of newly carved blocks. The smell of dust and copper filled the air. He would run his fingers along the fine edges of chiselling and imagine the shape that would one day hold his father's body. He understood that the pyramid was not merely a tomb, it was a promise to the gods that order would outlast chaos. Sometimes Khufu allowed the young prince to stand beside him during the ceremonies. The pharaoh would point toward the horizon, where the first light of dawn painted the sky in gold. "The sun rises for those who honour Ma'at," he would say. "As long as balance is kept, Egypt will endure." Khafre took those words into his heart. He began to believe that to build was to serve, and to serve was to preserve the divine pattern of the world. But childhood is fleeting, even for a prince. He grew older as the Great Pyramid neared completion. The songs of the workers turned softer. The final stones were placed at the summit. One morning, when Khafre looked out from the camp, the structure no longer seemed like a mountain of blocks. It felt alive, breathing with light and shadow. He understood then that men could create something greater than themselves if their faith was strong enough. When the project ended, silence returned to Giza. The sound of chisels faded. The camps emptied. The young prince felt both awe and loneliness. The monument stood still, perfect, yet it left a void. What could ever follow such perfection? In that question, the seed of Khafre's destiny took root. He did not yet know it, but one day he would answer his father not with words, but with another creation, one that would stare across the sands forever, guarding the horizon for eternity. When Khufu died, the desert seemed to fall silent. The workers' camps were gone, but the Great Pyramid stood like a frozen sunbeam, its smooth sides catching the light with an almost divine calm. For Khafre, the loss was more than the death of a father. It was the loss of a living symbol. Khufu had been the centre of Egypt's universe, the axis between earth and sky. Now that axis had shifted, and the sun was left to stand in its shadow. The young prince walked alone along the base of the pyramid, hearing only the whisper of the wind. Each block seemed to carry his father's voice, distant, powerful, unanswerable. To live after such a man was both an honour and a curse. How could Khafre, still learning the weight of command, ever match the legend of the one who had built perfection itself? Yet Egypt demanded it. The priests spoke of continuity, of divine order that could not be broken. As the Father ascends to the stars, they said, the Son must anchor the earth. It was a sacred balance, and Khafre knew that he could not turn away. His brother Jedefre took the throne, and the palace filled with murmurs. Some saw him as the rightful heir, others as an ambitious usurper. Khafre remained in the background, quiet and observant, studying how power shifted hands and how quickly loyalty could fade. The air of the court grew tense. Alliances formed and dissolved like mirages. The priests debated whether the soul of Khufu had truly reached the heavens, or if some part of it still lingered in the stone. Jedefre's reign was short, ending in mystery, a sudden break in the line of command that historians would never fully explain. When Khafre finally took the double crown, Egypt sighed with relief. The turmoil ended, and the new Pharaoh stood before the people, calm as the desert at dawn. He did not shout, did not promise conquest or glory. His first decree was one of restoration, to bring harmony back to the two lands. He reopened the quarries at Tura and Aswan, not for new monuments yet, but to renew temples and repair what neglect had touched. He wanted Egypt to breathe again. Yet the question remained, how to exist in the shadow of a god? Khafre could not compete with size. The Great Pyramid would always dominate the horizon. So he sought a different kind of greatness, one born of meaning rather than magnitude. He dreamed of a monument that would speak not to power, but to presence. Something that would look upon the world with timeless calm, embodying the silent watch of the divine. At dusk he often climbed the plateau alone, where the rock beneath his feet was streaked with quartz and sand. From there he could see the line of his father's pyramid, the river winding far below, and beyond that the glow of the setting sun. To him the horizon was not an end but a promise. The desert seemed eternal, yet he sensed a secret sleeping within it, a form waiting to be revealed, not built. In the stillness of those evenings, the first image of the Sphinx began to stir within his thoughts, like a shadow taking breath. It was not yet stone, not yet lion or man, but an idea, something ancient whispering through the sands, calling his name softly with the voice of eternity. The coronation of Khafre was an act of living myth. It took place under a sky painted with sunlight, in the temple courtyard where incense curled like breath from the gods. The priests stood in rows, their white linen robes glowing in the heat, as the golden double crown was lifted high. "Behold Horus Khafre," the high priest proclaimed, "the son of Ra, ruler of the two lands." At that moment the young pharaoh ceased to be a man. He became a bridge between heaven and earth, between mortal and eternal. The people knelt, and the trumpets of copper sounded across the desert, echoing against the limestone cliffs of Giza. Khafre's throne name meant appearing like Ra. It symbolized light breaking through darkness, the sun reborn every morning. The falcon of Horus spread its wings across his cartouche, declaring that his vision would protect Egypt as the falcon guards the sky. Yet beneath the solemn rituals, the new pharaoh remained human, a man aware of the vast expectation upon his shoulders. He ruled not only in the name of gods, but also under the long shadow of his father's perfection. The early days of his reign were filled with ceremony. Envoys arrived from Nubia, Syria, and Byblos bearing gifts of gold, lapis, and fragrant oils. Scribes recorded each offering with careful hands, marking Khafre's ascension as a moment of restored harmony. The Nile was generous that year, flooding evenly across the plains. Crops grew tall, and the granaries swelled. To the people, it was proof that the gods approved of their new king. Khafre's first act was to restore the temples neglected during his brother's reign. He ordered new statues of Ra and Osiris to be carved, their faces serene and eternal. He repaired sacred causeways, reopened workshops, and called back the artisans who had once built the Great Pyramid. To them, he promised fair labour, food, and rest. He believed devotion grew not from fear, but from dignity. Within the palace, his council debated expansion, new quarries, new monuments. But Khafre resisted haste. He preferred silence before command. Each decision was measured, each decree shaped with care. He believed that a pharaoh should not chase immortality. He should let immortality find him through balance. Yet deep within, a quiet fire was growing. The desire to leave behind something that would not merely remind the world of his name, but embody his spirit. At night, he withdrew to the palace roof, gazing toward the desert plateau. The wind whispered through the darkness, carrying the faint smell of stone dust. From there he could see the faint outline of his father's pyramid glowing under the moonlight, a reminder, a challenge, and a comfort all at once. The stars above him traced the same patterns his ancestors had followed for centuries, unchanging and infinite. He thought of Maat, the principle of truth and order, and how fragile it was in the hands of men. He vowed that his reign would honour it not through power, but through permanence. His monuments would not reach higher, they would reach deeper into the heart of the land itself. He envisioned a structure born from the living rock, not built but revealed, a guardian to watch over Egypt as he did. The falcon on his crown seemed to shimmer under the starlight as though the heavens themselves approved. The pharaoh closed his eyes, and the sound of the wind became a voice, ancient, patient, calling him toward destiny. The idea first came quietly, like wind shaping sand. Khafre often walked alone along the edge of the Giza plateau, where the limestone bedrock lay bare beneath the sun. The air there was heavy with heat, and the silence was so complete that even his footsteps seemed hesitant to disturb it. He studied the shapes carved by time, ridges, hollows, and natural rises that seemed almost deliberate. One formation in particular caught his eye, a mound of stone eroded by centuries of wind, long and uneven, yet with a curve that suggested a sleeping form. It seemed to breathe under the sun. To others, it was just rock. To Khafre, it was a sign. The priest taught that every place in Egypt was alive with spirit, a car within stone, water, and air. Some mountains held the power of gods, others of guardians. Khafre believed the plateau itself was sacred, a bridge between heaven and the underworld. When he gazed upon that mound, he saw not a coincidence of erosion, but an ancient being waiting to awaken. The lion was a symbol of the sun and strength. The human face represented divine wisdom. What if both could be joined? A body of power, a face of mind, a creature that would embody the Pharaoh himself, watching the sunrise for eternity. One evening, as the horizon burned with orange light, Khafre spoke softly to his chief architect, a man named Ankef. "What if we carve from the living rock itself?" he asked. "Not build, not assemble, release." The architect frowned, unsure. Cutting from solid stone was dangerous. The desert's bedrock was unpredictable. A single crack could destroy months of labour. But Khafre's voice held no uncertainty. "The gods left us this shape," he said. "We must only reveal it." Ankef returned the next morning with his tools and a handful of trusted sculptors. They began to study the mound. With charcoal and pigment they marked lines across its surface, tracing what the shape might become. The lion's body appeared first, long and regal, stretched toward the rising sun. Then came the head, not of a beast, but of a man. The more they sketched, the clearer the vision grew. The Pharaoh watched in silence. He knew it was not only stone they were touching, but eternity. The decision to carve such a form from living rock was revolutionary. Every monument before had been built block by block, an act of construction. This would be an act of revelation. It was as if the earth itself were a canvas, and Khafre merely guided its awakening. Priests were summoned to bless the site. They burned incense and poured milk into the sand as an offering to the gods beneath. "May the spirit of the lion guard the horizon," they chanted. "May the Pharaoh's face never fade." For days afterward, Khafre returned each dawn to stand before the chosen rock. The first cuts had begun, sending clouds of pale dust into the morning air. The sound of chisels echoed across the plain, sharp, rhythmic, almost like music. The workers sang softly, timing their strikes to the pulse of their songs. Slowly, the shape emerged from the earth, its eyes still blind, its body still bound. Yet even in its incomplete form, the creature already radiated something immense, a stillness older than Egypt itself. Khafre stood with the sun behind him, his shadow falling across the stone, and whispered, "Awaken." As the seasons turned, the plateau of Giza transformed into a living workshop. From dawn until dusk the hum of tools filled the air. The same land that had once echoed with the building of Khufu's pyramid now resonated with the rhythm of chisels cutting directly into the bedrock. There were no blocks to haul this time, no grand ramps rising to the sky. Everything happened on the ground, close to the earth, as if Egypt itself were offering its skin to the hands of men. Khafre would arrive each morning before the sun cleared the horizon. He came not as a distant ruler, but as a silent witness. The workers bowed but were not interrupted. He preferred to watch rather than command. The lines of the lion's body were now visible, stretching 40 meters long. The paws reached forward, powerful yet serene, while the unfinished head towered above the workers like a mountain half-born. The architects measured every angle with cords and wooden plumbs, ensuring that the proportions matched the geometry of Mayat. Perfect order. Even the slope of the back was aligned to the stars, as if the creature itself were a cosmic instrument. The air shimmered with heat. The dust coated everything in gold. Yet the labourers endured, driven not by fear but by a strange pride. They knew they were part of something that would outlast their names. They called the monument Shepses Ankh, the living image, though some whispered another name, Horus in the horizon. The priests came daily with offerings, bread, beer, milk, and incense. They believed the carving disturbed ancient spirits, and that peace must be maintained between realms. Songs were sung to appease the desert winds, believed to be voices of the ancestors. Khafre often joined the rituals, his hands lifted toward the rising sun. "Let this guardian hold back the chaos," he would pray. "Let it protect the balance of the two lands." His words were carried away by the wind, but somehow the workers felt them settle into the stone. As the months passed, new challenges emerged. The face of the Sphinx required precision beyond any previous craft. The limestone was softer near the surface, risking cracks and collapse. Khafre, the chief architect, ordered wooden scaffolds built around the head, wrapping it like a cocoon. Workers climbed with copper chisels and mallets, shaping each contour under the watchful eye of the pharaoh. The nose, the mouth, the eyes, all were refined with slow reverence. It was said that Khafre himself stood for hours as they modelled the features after his own. Not vanity, but symbolism. Pharaoh and guardian as one, man and lion sharing the same eternal gaze. When the sun reached its highest point, the entire plateau shimmered with heat, and mirages danced between the monuments. The Great Pyramid loomed to the north, Khafre's own pyramid rising beside it, and between them this colossal figure slowly emerged, a silent watcher connecting heaven, earth, and the realm of kings. Travellers from the delta who caught sight of it from afar fell to their knees, believing they had seen a god resting on the horizon, and perhaps, in some way, they had. Each evening, when work ceased, the workers sat together around fires, their laughter mingling with the desert wind. They spoke of how the Sphinx would outlive them, how its shadow would one day fall upon generations unborn. Khafre listened from a distance, feeling both pride and melancholy. He knew they were right. The monument was no longer his alone. It belonged to time. In the soft glow of twilight, he turned back toward his palace, whispering to himself, "Stone remembers." The face was the final and most sacred challenge. For months the sculptors had chipped away at the great mound until the lion's body lay smooth beneath the sun. But the head required the hand of divinity. Khafre knew that whatever expression the Sphinx would wear would define not only his reign, but the way eternity itself would see him. To carve a human face from the living rock was to risk imperfection, to give form to the unseen. Each strike of the chisel was a prayer and a danger. The workers moved slowly, guided by sketches drawn in pigment on the stone, their outlines traced by priests before dawn. The copper tools dulled quickly, forcing the craftsmen to sharpen them again and again on sandstone blocks. Yet the shape began to emerge, a strong jaw, full lips, and calm eyes that looked not at the world, but through it. Many historians would one day argue whether the Sphinx bore Khafre's likeness, but those who stood beneath it during its creation never doubted. They saw how the pharaoh's face mirrored the carving's serenity, neither smiling nor stern, simply infinite. Khafre's presence guided every decision. He would stand before the workers, silently touching the stone where the eyes would be, then step back into the sunlight, allowing them to continue. It was said that he believed the Sphinx should not look like him, but through him, the human vessel of divine sight. As the features grew clearer, so too did the monument's power. People began to approach the plateau not as a work site, but as a temple. Pilgrims brought offerings to the unfinished statue, bread, oils, flowers, and small figurines carved from alabaster. They believed the Lion Man could already hear them. The priests, sensing its growing aura, declared it a living presence, a manifestation of Ra's eternal watch over Egypt. They named it Hora-Makhet, Horus of the Horizon. From that moment the Sphinx was no longer a project, it was a god. The craftsmen noticed strange things as they worked. Their voices carried farther than usual, as if the air itself were listening. The sound of hammers on limestone would echo long after each strike, fading slowly into the desert silence. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, it seemed to breathe through the carving's nostrils like the exhale of a sleeping giant. At night, the moonlight clung to its face, giving it a ghostly life. The workers whispered that the Sphinx was already awake, waiting only for the pharaoh's final blessing to open its eyes. Khafre himself began to feel the monument's presence in his dreams. He saw the stone watching him, patient, knowing. In his visions, the Sphinx spoke without words, telling him that it was not merely a guardian for his tomb, but for Egypt itself. It would protect the balance long after his descendants were dust. He would awaken before sunrise, his heart filled with a calm both heavy and sacred. Standing before the monument, he would whisper his gratitude to the gods and to the land that had given him life. When at last the carving was complete, the workers stepped back and fell silent. The Sphinx gazed eastward, its eyes catching the first light of dawn. For a brief moment it seemed alive, the stone glowing with the colour of the morning sun. Khafre stood before it, the desert wind sweeping his cloak, and understood that he had not created a monument. He had revealed a soul that had always been waiting beneath the sands. When the carving of the Sphinx was complete, Khafre ordered a temple to be built before it, a place where the first light of dawn would pass directly between two stone pylons and fall upon the guardian's face. This temple would be his offering to Ra, the sun god, and to the balance that held Egypt together. The workers who had shaped the lion now turned their hands to smooth limestone blocks, stacking them into walls that glowed white under the morning sky. The causeway connecting the temple to Khafre's pyramid was lined with statues of the pharaoh himself, seated in quiet majesty. Each figure faced east, mirroring the Sphinx's eternal gaze. To approach the complex was to walk through time, from the realm of the living to the threshold of the divine. The design of the temple was unlike anything Egypt had seen. It was built low and square, its symmetry precise, its silence deliberate. No hieroglyphs, no bright colours, only polished stone and shafts of light. The architects said it was meant not to impress the eye, but to humble the soul. When the sun rose, its rays entered the temple, flooding the inner chamber in gold. There, priests performed morning rituals, lighting incense and pouring milk into stone basins as offerings. The air shimmered with heat and prayer. Khafre attended these ceremonies often. He would arrive before dawn, dressed not in gold but in simple linen, and stand behind the priests as they greeted the sun. He did not speak, only watched. In those moments the pharaoh seemed both man and monument, still, unmoving, as if carved from the same rock as the Sphinx itself. The temple was his meditation, a bridge between heaven's fire and the cool breath of the desert. Beyond its beauty, the temple served a deeper purpose. It anchored the Sphinx within the sacred geometry of Giza. Together with Khafre's pyramid and the valley temple near the Nile, it formed a perfect alignment, a celestial triangle reflecting the path of the sun across the sky. Priests believed this design would ensure that the pharaoh's Ka, his life force, would follow the sun forever, rising each morning to guard Egypt anew. Travellers who came to Giza were awed by the harmony of it all. They spoke of how the sun seemed to pause above the Sphinx before climbing higher, as though offering respect. At night, the moonlight cast long shadows across the temple floor, turning the space into a silent ocean of silver. Those who stood there claimed they could feel a pulse within the stone, a rhythm that matched the beating of their own hearts. Khafre knew he had fulfilled his purpose. His father had built the mountain that touched the stars. He had built the horizon that caught the light. Where Khufu's greatness reached upward, Khafre's reached outward, into eternity itself. The temple and the Sphinx stood as one, breathing together in stone and sun, reminding all who looked upon them that gods do not always speak in thunder. Sometimes they whisper through silence. Not far from the Sphinx, at the edge of the desert where the sand met the fertile lands of the Nile, Khafre ordered another structure to rise, the Valley Temple. It was here that the living would meet the dead, where the body of the pharaoh would one day be received before its journey to eternity. The temple was built of colossal limestone blocks, some weighing more than 200 tons, hauled from the quarries by hundreds of men using sledges and rope. Unlike the light of the Sphinx temple, the Valley Temple was a place of shadow and stillness. Its walls were smooth, undecorated, and cool even in the heat of noon. Polished granite columns reflected the flicker of oil lamps, creating the illusion of water beneath the stone ceiling. The architects designed it to mirror the underworld, quiet, enclosed, without sound or wind. When a visitor stepped inside, the noise of the outside world faded completely. The only sound was the echo of footsteps against the floor like distant thunder. At its centre stood a hall filled with statues of Khafre, each identical, carved from diorite so dark it seemed blue in the dim light. The pharaoh appeared seated, hands resting calmly on his knees, his face tranquil and unyielding. There were 23 of them, arranged as if he were everywhere at once, eternal and unchanging. The people believed these statues housed parts of Khafre's soul, fragments of his Ka that would remain to watch over Egypt even after death. Priests would anoint each one daily with oil, whispering prayers that bound spirit to stone. At sunrise, the rays from the temple's entrance struck the first statue directly, as if awakening the god within. At sunset, the same light fell across the Sphinx outside, connecting the two temples in a perfect circle of rebirth. Khafre walked these halls often, his footsteps soft against the granite floor. He would pause before his own likeness and study the stone face that mirrored his own. Did he wonder, even then, which of them was more real, the man of flesh or the one of diorite? To rule Egypt was to live half in this world and half beyond it. The Valley Temple was not just his future resting place, it was a rehearsal for eternity. The artisans who worked there spoke of strange sensations. Some said the statues seemed to breathe when touched by lamplight, others that the air grew heavier as night fell. Perhaps it was only imagination, yet even the skeptics found themselves whispering within its walls. The temple demanded reverence. Outside, the causeway stretched upward from the valley to the pyramid itself, lined with palm trees and guarded by stone lions. It was along this sacred path that Khafre's body would someday travel, from river to tomb, from light into shadow. But while he still lived, the causeway represented life's journey, a reminder that every pharaoh must walk between the worlds of man and God. To later generations, the Valley Temple would seem impossibly old, its purpose nearly forgotten. Yet its stones would remain cool and silent, untouched by time. For even when sand buried the statues and centuries erased the names, the air within those walls would still hold the quiet presence of the king who once walked there, watching over the land he loved. Khafre's reign became a season of calm, a pause in Egypt's long rhythm of rise and decline. The floods came when they should, neither too weak nor too strong. The harvests were generous, the granaries full. Traders from distant lands brought gifts to his court, lapis from the east, incense from Punt, and fine cedar from the mountains of Lebanon. The pharaoh accepted these treasures not as wealth, but as signs that Mayat, the balance of the world, remained intact. For him, prosperity was not measured in gold, but in harmony, the quiet pulse of a kingdom that moved as one. His court at Memphis was a place of order. The viziers oversaw records of grain and trade, the priests charted the stars, and the scribes filled the archives with lines of perfect hieroglyphs. Justice was swift but calm. Khafre preferred persuasion to punishment, believing that chaos began not with rebellion but with misunderstanding. He often listened to disputes himself, seated beneath a canopy woven with blue lotus petals. The petitioners would kneel before him, trembling, yet his voice was never harsh. Mayat is not about victory, he would remind them. It is about balance. Beyond the palace walls, Egypt thrived. Canals were repaired, new fields were irrigated, and temples once abandoned were restored. Artists painted scenes of peace and fertility, farmers wading through water with sickles, children playing by the riverbanks, herds of cattle grazing beneath the palms. It was a vision of paradise, yet Khafre knew how fragile it could be. The desert was always waiting, a vast silence pressing against the green edge of life. He saw his duty as the barrier between that silence and his people. Each year, the Feast of the Sun marked the renewal of this promise. At dawn, the priest would lead a procession from the Valley Temple to the Sphinx, carrying torches and golden vessels of sacred oil. The people followed, singing hymns that filled the desert air. As the sun rose, the first light touched the Sphinx's face, and Khafre stepped forward to pour oil upon its pores. The crowd fell silent. The Pharaoh raised his hands and spoke a prayer known only to kings, a vow to uphold truth, protect order, and keep darkness from the land. When he finished, the priest scattered lotus petals into the wind. They floated toward the horizon like tiny suns. After the ceremony, Khafre would remain behind long after the priests and crowds had gone. He would stand before the Sphinx, the desert stretching endlessly before him. Sometimes the wind carried the faint sound of the workers who had built it years ago, their laughter buried in memory. He thought of them often, not as labourers, but as souls who had shared in something divine. "We built this together," he would whisper, "and it will watch over us all." The years that followed brought no great wars, no uprisings, no famine. Egypt rested in equilibrium, the kind that poets would later describe as the sleep of Ra. Yet even in stillness, time was moving. The Sphinx faced each sunrise unchanged, but Khafre, the man who had dreamed it, was beginning to feel the slow approach of twilight. In the later years of his reign, Khafre began to notice a change not in the land, but in the air around it. The temple still filled with chants each morning, the Nile still rose as it always had, yet something subtle had shifted, a distance between man and God. The priests spoke of omens, stars flickering at unusual hours, desert winds that carried whispers through the night. Khafre listened but did not fear. He had always believed that silence was not absence, it was the gods thinking. Still, as the years deepened, he found himself walking more often among his monuments, seeking answers not from priests but from stone. At dusk, he would visit the Sphinx alone. The sands had already begun to creep back toward its base, the desert slowly reclaiming what it had once yielded. Workers cleared it regularly, but the wind was relentless. Each grain seemed determined to hide the guardian's paws, to bury eternity under the patience of time. Khafre stood there in quiet awe, realizing that even the greatest monuments must fight to remain visible. He brushed his fingers against the warm limestone, feeling the pulse of centuries yet to come. Even gods, he murmured, must be remembered to be alive. His dreams grew heavier. Some nights he saw the Sphinx with its eyes open and glowing like the sun. Other nights he saw it buried, its head just barely visible above the dunes. Once he dreamed that it spoke to him in the voice of his father. "What you reveal must one day sleep again." He would wake before dawn, the words still echoing. The dreams did not frighten him. They humbled him. They reminded him that every age believed it was eternal, yet every age eventually faded into sand. The priests urged him to build more temples, to ensure his memory would outlast his body. But Khafre resisted the call for excess. "What more should I command," he told them, "when the sun itself is my witness?" He believed that true immortality came not from more stone, but from the stillness of faith. His monuments already spoke the language of eternity. More words would only clutter the silence. One morning, after a night of restless sleep, Khafre journeyed upriver to visit the Temple of Ra at Heliopolis. There, beneath the towering obelisks, he stood before the great altar and lifted his hands to the sky. "If the gods are silent," he said, "let it be because they are listening." The high priest beside him bowed his head. Later that day, the river flooded early, breaking its banks with gentle force. To the priests it was an omen of favour. To Khafre it was an answer, subtle, calm, like the whisper of stone under wind. From that day on, he no longer questioned the quiet. He accepted it as part of the balance he had always served. In the evenings, he would watch the sunset from his palace terrace, the sky burning orange above the plateau. The Sphinx's face caught the last light, and for a moment, the silence of the gods felt less like distance and more like peace. The years of stillness gave Khafre time to see what few kings ever understood, that ruling was not a matter of command, but of endurance. Each morning he rose before dawn to receive the priests and scribes. Reports of harvests, building, trade, all the details that bound a kingdom together. He listened, he decided, he blessed. But beneath his calm voice lay an awareness that the order he guarded was fragile. The gods gave balance, yet man was the one who had to maintain it. Even a single careless hand could tip the scale. His sons had grown strong and confident, each believing himself destined to inherit the throne. Khafre loved them, but he saw in their eyes the same restlessness that had once driven his brother Jedefre. Ambition, even clothed in loyalty, could turn sharp. The pharaoh knew that succession would test not just his family, but the idea of Maat itself. Egypt's peace depended on unity, so he spoke often to his children of duty rather than glory. "You will not rule to surpass me," he told them, "but to continue what has already been set in motion. A pharaoh's greatness lies not in size, but in steadiness." Yet even as he spoke, he felt the slow ache of age creeping into his bones. The mornings grew colder, the stairs to the terrace steeper. He began to move with the same rhythm as the desert itself, slow, deliberate, ancient. Still, his presence carried power. When he entered the temple courts, even the wind seemed to pause. The people who once saw him as a man now bowed as if before a god. It was not fear that moved them, but awe, the kind born of seeing someone live so long in harmony with the divine order. The Sphinx became his companion in these years. At times, he would sit near its paws for hours, saying nothing. The priest thought he prayed, but he was only listening, to the desert, to memory, to the faint hum that seemed to come from the stone itself. He found comfort in its stillness, as though the monument absorbed his worries and gave back peace. Once, during a rare sandstorm, when the air turned red and the horizon vanished, Khafre refused to retreat to safety. "If the Sphinx can face the storm," he said, "so can I." When the storm cleared, he stood covered in dust, smiling faintly. The priest later wrote that the pharaoh had become part of the desert that day, both flesh and symbol. At night he dreamed of his youth, the voices of the workers, the smell of limestone, the rhythm of hammers against rock. They returned to him with such clarity that he would wake and almost expect to see the unfinished pyramid before him again. But when he looked out his window, the monuments were complete, their silence absolute. He realized then that creation had ended. His task was no longer to build, but to preserve. Sometimes he wondered whether the crown had ever truly been his, or if it had always belonged to the land. "We are only caretakers," he whispered once to his vizier. "The throne is eternal. We merely keep it from turning to dust." The vizier bowed, unable to answer. In the flickering light of the oil lamps, Khafre's eyes glowed with the same calm as the Sphinx. He had carried the weight of the crown all his life, but now it rested lightly, as if it too had learned the meaning of peace. As Khafre aged, he found himself drawn more and more to the Nile. The river had always been Egypt's heartbeat, its rhythm the same pulse that guided the rise and fall of kings. It flowed past palaces and fields, through temples and tombs, carrying silt, life, and memory. To Khafre, it was not water, but time itself, a current that began before his birth and would continue long after his name faded from the tongues of men. He would board a small royal bark at dusk and drift along the calm surface, the oarsmen rowing in slow, even strokes. The sun sank behind the desert, and the reflection of his pyramid shimmered in the golden water. He often said that in the river's mirror a man could see the truth of his reign. The priest accompanied him sometimes, reciting hymns to Hapi, the god of the flood. They spoke of how the Nile renewed the earth, just as Ra renewed the sky each morning. But Khafre listened more to the quiet than to their words. He felt a kinship with the river, steady, patient, eternal in motion, yet always still. "A ruler should be like this," he told his son one evening. "He must move the world forward, yet leave the surface undisturbed." On these journeys, the pharaoh reflected on all he had seen. He thought of his father's towering pyramid, of the Sphinx's silent gaze, of the workers who had sung beneath the sun. He remembered the first time he had touched the stone that would become his monument, still rough, unformed, waiting for his dream to shape it. He wondered if he too had been shaped by something greater, carved by the unseen hand of destiny. The thought comforted him. It meant his life had always been part of a larger design. At night, when the bark was anchored and the campfires flickered along the shore, he would lie on the deck and look up at the stars. The sky above Egypt was an ocean of fire, clear and endless. He traced the familiar constellations, Orion, the Falcon, the Bull, and felt as though he could read eternity itself. The priest said those stars were the souls of kings, sailing forever across the heavens. Khafre smiled at the thought. "Then one day," he said softly, "I will join them, not to rule, but to keep watch." As the river carried him home, dawn began to bloom on the horizon. The first light struck the face of the Sphinx, miles away yet perfectly aligned with his view. Its eyes caught the glow as if awakening to greet him. The pharaoh closed his eyes and listened to the quiet rustle of reeds, the faint cry of distant birds. Everything felt complete. The river, the sky, the stone, all parts of one endless circle. When he returned to his palace, Khafre stood once more upon his terrace. The wind carried the scent of the Nile and the sound of life from the valley below. He felt no fear of death, no longing for immortality. "We are made of water and light," he whispered, "and we return to both." From that day, he no longer spoke of monuments or legacy. He had seen eternity reflected in the river, and it was enough. The older Khafre grew, the more Egypt depended on his calm. The officials around him had begun to age as well, their hair turning white, their steps slower. But the pharaoh's presence remained steady, like a pillar against the wind. To his people, he was no longer merely a ruler. He was the rhythm of the land itself. In his eyes, they saw the same quiet certainty that the Sphinx held. To live under Khafre was to live in balance, to feel that the sun and river and harvest all answered to a single, invisible harmony. Each morning, he attended the rituals of Ma'at, the ceremony of balance. The high priest would raise a golden feather, symbol of truth, and place it beside a small figurine of the goddess. The pharaoh would then offer bread and incense, whispering words that only he was permitted to speak. The rite was ancient, older even than the pyramids, and Khafre performed it with unwavering devotion. "As long as the scales remain even," he told his priests, "the kingdom will not fall." He had come to believe that every lie, every injustice, every careless word could disturb that balance, sending ripples across the Nile and up into the heavens. His reign became a discipline of restraint. He ruled through patience and example, and Egypt followed. The scribes recorded his decrees with precision. Taxes were fair and punishments measured. He encouraged the study of the stars and the recording of time, believing that knowledge itself was part of Ma'at. Under his command, astronomers mapped the heavens with new accuracy, aligning temple corridors to the rising of Sirius and the equinox. The priest said that when Ra looked down upon Egypt, he saw his own reflection, a world in order, a kingdom of light. Yet the pharaoh was not blind to decay. He knew that nothing stayed perfect forever. A broken tool, a careless hand, a harvest lost to drought. All these were signs that the balance needed tending. When a sandstorm damaged the temple roof near Giza, Khafre journeyed there himself instead of sending servants. The workers bowed, astonished, as the aging ruler stepped among them, his sandals sinking into the dust. "The gods built with us once," he said quietly. "We must build with them again." His presence lifted their spirits, and by sunset the roof was repaired. The people began to tell stories of him not as a man, but as a living principle, the keeper of the invisible order. Children were taught that Khafre could calm storms with a gesture, that his voice kept the Nile's floods in rhythm. None of this was true, and yet, in some way, it was. His reign had made Egypt believe again in the possibility of harmony. In the evenings, he would sit with his scribes and listen to poetry recited by young students. The words spoke of life and balance, of love between gods and mortals. Sometimes he smiled and added a line himself. "The river flows because it remembers," he once said, "and man endures because he listens." The scribes wrote it down, uncertain if it was law or verse. Khafre only laughed softly. For him, there was little difference between the two. As night fell over Giza, the desert cooled and the stars returned. The Sphinx lay silent under moonlight, and from his balcony the Pharaoh watched its shadow stretch toward the valley. He knew that one day that shadow would cover him too, and he found comfort in the thought. Balance, after all, meant that every beginning must have its end. As the years drifted on, the desert began to reclaim its own. The wind, which had once carried the songs of workers and priests, now swept the plateau with slow, whispering breaths, lifting grains of sand that settled against the base of the Sphinx and along the causeways. The guards and caretakers swept daily, but the dunes were patient. Each night they crept a little closer, as if the desert were testing the endurance of human will. Khafre did not see it as a threat. "This is the way of the world," he told his attendants. "The sand covers and man uncovers. It is a conversation, not a battle." The Sphinx, once gleaming white beneath the sun, had begun to fade to the colour of honey. Its nose and lips, still sharp in detail, caught the dawn light with a warm glow that changed each season. The priests continued their rituals before it, but fewer pilgrims came now. The novelty had given way to reverence, and reverence in time to routine. Khafre understood. Even miracles, when seen too often, become part of the landscape. He did not mind. The Sphinx had never been built to astonish. It had been built to endure. One morning, after a night of wind so fierce that it shook the palace shutters, Khafre rode out to Giza alone. The guards followed at a distance, their horses nervous in the cold air. When the Pharaoh reached the plateau, he dismounted and approached the monument on foot. The sand was piled high around its paws, covering the inscriptions carved there long ago. He placed his hand upon the stone and closed his eyes. Beneath the surface, he imagined he could feel the faint vibration of time itself, the slow heartbeat of eternity. "You're still awake," he whispered to the lion, "even when the world forgets to look." The wind carried his voice away, but the Sphinx seemed to hear. For a brief moment the air stilled. The desert, endless and unfeeling, bowed to silence. Khafre stood there until the sun climbed high, then turned toward his pyramid. Its smooth casing stones still caught the light like frozen fire. In their reflection, he saw his own life, bright once, now soft and golden. When he returned to Memphis, he summoned his chief scribe. "Write this," he said. "Everything we build is conversation with the desert. When we stop speaking, it answers with sand." The scribe hesitated. "Shall I record it as a decree?" "No," said the Pharaoh, "as a truth." The phrase spread quietly among the scholars and builders. They began to see their work not as conquest, but as dialogue, to honour the land rather than dominate it. To Khafre, this was the final lesson of his reign. The desert would always win, yes, but in yielding to it with grace, mankind could share in its eternity. That evening, as he stood once more on his balcony, the first cool breeze of night brushed his face. He could smell the sand in it, dry and ancient. Somewhere in the distance a jackal howled, the voice of Anubis, guardian of the dead. Khafre smiled faintly. "The desert speaks," he said to himself, "and I am listening." Sleep had once come easily to Khafre. In youth, his nights were deep and dreamless, like the still water of the Nile before dawn. But now, as age wrapped itself around him like linen, his mind drifted freely between waking and memory. Each dream felt real enough to touch, filled with the scent of stone dust and the cry of cranes above the quarries. More and more one vision returned, the same each time. He stood before the Sphinx, but it was not buried or silent. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, and its wings, yes, wings, spread wide over the horizon. The lion's body had become a falcon, soaring above the desert in radiant calm. It circled the pyramids, casting a shadow shaped like eternity itself. In the dream, Khafre followed it across the sands, his feet leaving no prints. When the falcon landed, it folded its wings and turned its gaze toward him. "Do you understand now?" the voice seemed to ask, though no words were spoken. "I am not stone, and you are not bound by time." He would wake at that moment, his heart steady, not frightened but filled with a quiet certainty. He began to believe that the dream was not illusion, but revelation, a message from Horus, whose spirit had guided his life since coronation. He shared the vision with no one, not even his priests. It was too sacred, too personal. Instead, he began to rise before dawn and walk to the eastern terrace of the palace. There he would stand in silence, facing the horizon as the first light appeared. Sometimes he imagined the Sphinx blinking at the same instant, as if greeting the day beside him. The old Pharaoh found peace in these moments. The world no longer demanded his decisions or his strength. It asked only his presence. Yet, within him, the dream grew stronger. The falcon returned night after night, flying higher each time, until finally it disappeared into the sun. When Khafre woke after that final vision, he understood. The Sphinx was not only a guardian for the world of men, it was also a reminder that kings themselves were guardians of balance. "When I am gone," he whispered to the dawn, "my name will fade, but the Watcher will remain. It will see what I cannot." The priest noticed a change in him. He smiled more often, spoke less, and spent long hours in contemplation. When they asked what occupied his thoughts, he only said, "Flight." They didn't understand, and he did not explain. One morning he asked his artisans to carve a small amulet of a falcon from lapis lazuli, a simple piece, light enough to rest upon his chest. "Not as a symbol of power," he said, "but of release." They obeyed, unaware that it would one day lie within his tomb, upon his heart. The river flooded that year more beautifully than anyone remembered. The people celebrated, unaware that their king was preparing quietly for the journey that awaited him. As Khafre watched the waters rise, he thought again of his dream, the falcon dissolving into the sun, and smiled. "Everything returns," he murmured. "Even light must rest." The year the flood rose highest, Khafre declared a festival unlike any before. It would honour Ra, the sun that gave life to Egypt, and the Sphinx, the guardian that had watched over it. The priests called it the Festival of Light, a renewal of creation itself. For 7 days the people of the two lands gathered on the Giza plateau, bringing offerings of flowers, bread and sweet wine. Torches lined the causeway leading from the valley temple to the pyramid, their flames flickering like stars against the dark. Musicians played drums and flutes, their rhythms echoing off the stone walls. The air shimmered with heat and devotion. On the first morning, before the crowd arrived, Khafre went alone to the Sphinx. He placed his hand on the lion's cheek, now roughened by sand and time. "Old friend," he said softly, "we have seen many dawns together. May this one be remembered." The priest found him there and led him to the temple. As the sun broke the horizon, its light poured through the doorway, striking the altar and then the Sphinx's face beyond. The alignment was perfect, a moment when earth, sky, and man met in a single breath. The people gasped and fell to their knees. Khafre did not speak. He simply raised his hands to the light and closed his eyes. Throughout the festival, offerings flowed into the temples. Gold from Nubia, incense from Punt, fine linen from the Delta. Dancers performed before the altars, their bodies moving like flame, their songs calling the gods to witness. Each evening the priests lit new fires along the riverbanks, so that even at night the plateau glowed. From afar, travellers described it as if the pyramids themselves were aflame. On the third day, Khafre addressed his people for what would be the final time. Standing before the Sphinx, his voice carried over the desert wind. "You have built with me," he said. "You have prayed with me, and long after I am gone you will live beneath the same sun. Let it remind you that you are never alone. Each dawn is proof that the gods remember." The crowd answered with silence, the deep, reverent kind that means understanding. That night the moon rose red over the horizon. Khafre watched it from his balcony, its reflection rippling on the Nile. The festival fires burned far below, stretching in a golden chain toward Giza. "It is beautiful," he whispered, "and it will pass." He knew this would be the last great celebration of his life. The desert had begun to call to him in dreams again, not as a voice but as a presence, calm, infinite, waiting. On the seventh day, as the festival ended, the priest extinguished the final torch before dawn. The darkness that followed was vast yet peaceful. Then, as the first light touched the Sphinx once more, the world felt reborn. Khafre stood beside it, his heart steady. "Light returns," he said, "and so shall I." It was not a farewell, but a promise between king and eternity. After the festival of light, the rhythm of Khafre's life slowed to a quiet grace. The halls of his palace grew still, their walls echoing with the footsteps of servants moving softly through the morning haze. The pharaoh spent his days in the gardens, where papyrus and lotus grew around clear pools fed by the Nile. There he would sit for hours, watching dragonflies hover above the water, their wings flashing like shards of the sun. Age had gentled him. His once commanding voice had become low and measured. The court still bowed deeply when he entered, yet the air around him no longer felt heavy with authority. It felt peaceful, as though he carried the silence of the gods wherever he went. His sons now ruled much of the daily court business, and the viziers handled the endless petitions. Khafre intervened rarely, only when balance truly trembled. He preferred to listen rather than command, offering advice in words as light as the wind. "Power," he told his eldest, "is not what you hold in your hand. It is what you leave untouched." They did not always understand, but they remembered. Each morning he still visited the Sphinx. The monument had become almost buried up to its chest again, but its face remained clear. He often spoke to it softly as to an old friend. "You and I, we have kept our promise," he would say. "We have guarded the horizon." The priests watching from afar believed these were prayers. In truth, they were conversations between two beings who had shared the same silence for decades. One evening, as the sun sank behind the western dunes, Khafre climbed the plateau alone. His guards protested, but he dismissed them with a wave. The air was cool, the wind strong. Standing between his pyramid and the Sphinx, he felt as though the world were pausing to listen. "This," he whispered, "is how the end begins. Quietly." He thought of his father's voice, of the workers' songs, of the years when stone had risen like music from the desert. All of it felt near, as if time itself were folding. That night, he dreamed once more of the falcon, wings spread against the sun. It did not speak, yet he understood. It had come for him. He awoke before dawn, feeling no fear, only calm. He dressed in linen robes and walked out onto the terrace. The horizon glowed pale gold. For a moment he closed his eyes and breathed in the air, dry, clean, eternal. He had lived long enough to see the world change and remain the same. "Ra," he said softly, "if I have kept the balance, let me rest in your light." As he spoke, the first ray of the sun touched the face of the Sphinx miles away, and the light fell across the valley, reaching the palace walls. The servants who entered his chamber a short while later found him seated by the window, eyes open, lips curved in a faint smile. The morning breeze stirred the curtains, and for a heartbeat it seemed the air itself bowed in respect. The king of stone and sun had joined the horizon he loved. The day after Khafre's passing, Egypt did not mourn with noise or chaos. The kingdom entered silence, as if the desert itself had drawn a long breath and refused to exhale. The priests of Anubis prepared the body of the pharaoh with the same precision he had demanded in life, every motion measured, every word a whisper. They washed him in water from the Nile, perfumed his skin with oils of cedar and myrrh, and wrapped him in linen woven from the finest flax. Over his chest they placed the lapis falcon, gleaming with the blue of the sky. "May his spirit rise with Ra," they murmured. "May his heart be lighter than the feather of Maat." The funeral procession began before sunrise. The valley temple, the Sphinx, and the great causeway were veiled in mist. Priests led the march, their torches glowing like stars. Behind them came the musicians with soft flutes, then the priests bearing incense and lotus petals. Finally, upon a golden bark carried by 40 men, came the pharaoh himself, his mask radiant in the dawn light. The people lined the path, heads bowed, some weeping silently, others standing in awe. They did not cry for death, but for the closing of an age. As the procession reached the Sphinx, the priests halted. They poured milk and honey at its paws and spoke the ancient words of return. "He who built you now joins you," said the high priest. "Guard him as you have guarded the horizon." For a moment a breeze swept across the plateau, lifting the incense smoke toward the east. The witnesses swore they saw the light shimmer upon the Sphinx's face, as though it had bowed in acknowledgement. The journey continued up the causeway, toward the cool interior of the pyramid. Inside, the corridors glowed with the flicker of 1,000 lamps. The sarcophagus awaited in the heart of the chamber, carved from black basalt, smooth as glass. On its lid, artisans had engraved the symbol of the rising sun and the falcon of Horus. When the priests laid the pharaoh within, they placed beside him a small cup of water, a loaf of bread, and a carved figurine of the Sphinx, so that he may never thirst, never hunger, and never be alone, the priest said. Then they sealed the chamber, stone by stone, until the sound of the outer world was gone. Outside, the people sang hymns to Ra as the sun climbed higher. Its light touched the tip of the pyramid, then the Sphinx, then the river beyond. The alignment was perfect, as if the heavens themselves marked his passing. By noon, the plateau was quiet again. Only the wind remained, whispering through the sands. Yet those who stood near the Sphinx swore they heard something beneath it, a low, deep hum, like a heart still beating within the stone. The priests left offerings there for 40 days, wine, flowers, and bread. They said the king's soul had begun its voyage through the stars, guided by the falcon of the horizon. Each night they watched Orion rise above Giza, bright and clear, and believed that Khafre had taken his place among the eternal ones. Egypt slept in peace, for even in death, its ruler still kept watch. In the days following the burial, the priests recited the sacred texts of passage, known as the spells of the horizon. They described the soul's voyage beyond the sky, through gates guarded by fire and silence. For Khafre, the journey had begun the moment his tomb was sealed. His Ka, the life force, would rise from the pyramid's core, travel along shafts aligned with the stars, and ascend into the field of light where the gods awaited. The priest believed that his spirit rode on a solar bark across the heavens, guided by Ra himself. Each sunrise was a sign that the pharaoh lived again, reborn in radiance. In their chants, Khafre crossed the 12 gates of night, where serpents of darkness tried to devour the sun. At every gate he spoke the words of power he had learned in life. "I am the keeper of Ma'at. I am the balance between day and night." The guardians bowed, and he passed unharmed. He sailed upon the river of stars, surrounded by spirits of those who had built with him, masons, priests, and scribes, now freed from dust. Together they sang the songs of creation that once echoed through Giza. The sky, vast and silver, mirrored the desert below, and Khafre understood that eternity was not a place but a pattern. the same order he had spent his life preserving. On Earth, the priest performed mirror rituals to guide his passage. At dusk they lit fires along the causeway, symbolizing the stars that lit his path. At dawn, they extinguished them and lifted their hands toward the sun, calling his name. They did not mourn, they assisted. For to them, the Pharaoh's death was not an ending, but the continuation of cosmic duty. His reign had merely shifted from earth to sky. The people told stories of strange lights above Giza during those nights. Some said a new star appeared beside Orion's belt, glowing with the blue of lapis lazuli. Others claimed they heard music on the wind, faint, rhythmic, like the chants of workers long gone. "It is the king," the elders said, building once more, but now among the heavens. Inside the sealed pyramid, silence ruled. Yet deep within the stone, the air felt charged, as if holding the memory of a great breath. The walls, lined with smooth limestone, reflected the faint gleam of the oil lamps left burning at the final rite. The smell of cedar and resin lingered. The basalt sarcophagus lay at the centre, heavy and still. On its lid, the carved falcon seemed poised to take flight. The priest said that when the stars aligned perfectly over the pyramid, the soul of the pharaoh would leave through the northern shaft, the window to the imperishable stars, the realm of the undying. And when that night came, a meteor crossed the sky above Giza, bright, slow, and silent. The priests fell to their knees. They called it the flight of the falcon. From that moment they declared Khafre eternal, his bar united with the sun. The Sphinx remained his witness on earth, its gaze fixed upon the horizon, as if waiting for the day the sky would return what it had taken. Egypt continued to live under his balance, its people walking gently upon the sand that now held both king and cosmos. Years passed, and the reign of Khafre became memory. His sons ruled in his name, preserving the temples and tending the altars. The priests continued to pour offerings at the paws of the Sphinx each morning, whispering the prayers that kept the spirit of the king alive within the stone. For a time, Egypt remained in harmony, as if the shadow of Khafre still stretched across the land, protecting it from disorder. Farmers spoke his name during harvest, sailors carved his likeness on their boats, and children learned of the just Pharaoh who had ruled like the sun, steady, silent, and kind. The Sphinx and the pyramid became sacred to all who gazed upon them. Travellers from far provinces arrived with gifts, ivory figures, small jars of honey, and tiny gold amulets in the shape of the falcon. They believed that to stand before the Sphinx was to stand before the soul of Khafre himself. Yet even as reverence grew, the desert continued its slow encroachment. Winds carried fine sand into the cracks between stones, filling the causeway inch by inch. The workers who maintained the site aged, and their sons took their place, and then their sons after them. The Sphinx endured, but time, patient as always, began its quiet work. Generations passed. New pharaohs built new monuments. Dynasties rose and fell like the floods of the Nile. The names of kings multiplied, each seeking to claim the same eternity Khafre had already achieved. But none could command the silence of the desert the way he had. None could make stone breathe as he once did. His pyramid remained a beacon, yet travellers who came centuries later no longer remembered its builder's face. They spoke his name uncertainly: Khafre, Khephren, Cheops' son. The language shifted, but the presence remained. In the papyrus scrolls kept by temple scribes, his reign was described as the era of balance. The records told of peace, of full granaries, of the construction of a lion-faced god who watched the horizon forever. Scholars of later generations studied those writings and wondered how such perfection had existed. Some doubted he was real. Others said no mortal could have created the Sphinx. It must have been carved by the gods themselves. The truth, of course, lay buried beneath their feet. The fingerprints of workers still etched into the limestone, the marks of copper chisels faded by wind. But there were those who remembered in spirit. The priests of Ra kept a secret teaching. that Khafre had not died but merely changed form. They said that when the sun rose, it was his soul that lit the sky. When the Sphinx's shadow stretched across the sand, it was his hand blessing the land. At the great temple ceremonies, when light passed through the corridors to strike the altar, the high priest would whisper, "The king watches." And still, the Sphinx remained. It saw the coming of new kings, the decline of old gods, the birth of languages it would never speak. Empires would rise and vanish, and yet the stone face of Khafre, serene and unbroken, would gaze at the same sun he once greeted in life. Though the world forgot his voice, his silence endured, the same silence that had carried Egypt through its golden age. For those who dared to stand before it at dawn, when the first light touched its eyes, there was always a feeling, faint but unmistakable, that someone somewhere still kept the balance. Centuries drifted across the sands like shadows. The world changed, but the plateau of Giza endured, quiet, patient, ancient. Dynasties passed, each leaving its trace before fading into the desert. The pyramids remained, yet even they began to lose their perfection. The limestone casing that had once gleamed white as dawn was stripped away by time and men alike, used to build temples, palaces, even simple homes. What had been the crown of kings became the foundation of villages. The Sphinx too began to suffer. Its nose, once sharp and proud, cracked beneath centuries of wind. Its body, carved from softer stone, weathered under the relentless desert breath. The sands rose higher around its flanks until it seemed to be sinking into the earth it had once ruled. Priests still visited, though their rituals grew shorter, their voices less certain. The old language of the pyramid texts was fading from memory, replaced by newer tongues. Few could still read the prayers carved into the stone. To most who passed, the Sphinx was no longer Khafre's guardian, but a mystery, a relic of a forgotten age. They wondered who had built it, and why. Some said it was the image of a god older than Ra. Others claimed it had appeared from the earth itself, born of the desert's dream. What had once been history was now myth. Yet even as names were lost, something deeper remained. The people who lived near Giza spoke of strange dreams. Shepherds resting under the Sphinx's shadow claimed they heard whispers at night, a low hum, like the sound of a giant breathing beneath the sand. Merchants travelling past at dawn said the air there felt heavy, charged with unseen power. They left small offerings at its base, dates, oil, bits of silver, not because they remembered the pharaoh, but because they felt they should. The instinct to revere survived even when the reason was gone. The desert, meanwhile, performed its slow burial. Storm by storm it swallowed the guardian up to its neck, leaving only the face visible above the dunes. For travellers arriving from the Nile, it looked like a god emerging from the sand, half born, half dreaming. Some bowed in awe, others feared it. A few carved graffiti into its cheeks, marking their presence against eternity. But the Sphinx did not answer. It simply watched, as it always had, unmoving, untouched by the noise of time. In the nearby temples, the statues of Khafre crumbled. The black diorite that once gleamed like water dulled to the colour of ash. The inscriptions eroded, the names dissolved, yet the posture remained the same, serene, seated, eternal. The people no longer knew the name Khafre, but they still called the pyramid and Sphinx sacred. Even forgotten, he ruled. In the silence of night, when the moon shone white over the desert, the Sphinx cast its long shadow across the plateau, touching the very edge of the pyramid, and though no priest remained to speak the prayer, the light itself seemed to remember. Somewhere within the stone, beyond the reach of wind and sand, the soul of the pharaoh still lingered, patient, enduring, waiting to be remembered again. Time became an ocean, and the Sphinx sank slowly beneath its waves of sand. Entire centuries passed when no living soul looked upon its face. The plateau turned quiet, the temples buried, the causeway broken. The desert erased the footsteps of priests, merchants, and kings alike. Winds carved new patterns across the land, smooth and endless. At night, the stars wheeled overhead, tracing the same paths they had followed when Khafre himself stood beneath them. It was as if the heavens still remembered what the earth had chosen to forget. Beneath the dunes, the Sphinx slept. The sand that covered it acted like a shroud, but also like a shield. The relentless storms that scoured the open desert passed harmlessly above. Within that golden tomb of dust, the Guardian waited, untouched by the world's noise. The people of later ages spoke of it only in rumours, a buried god, a stone beast beneath the sands. They told stories by firelight of a giant whose breath stirred the wind, of a watcher who would awaken when Egypt called for balance once more. Few believed, but the stories endured. Far above, empires rose and fell. Foreign kings came and went. New gods claimed the temples. The Nile continued its eternal rhythm, feeding generations who no longer knew the names of those who first worshipped its floods. Yet somewhere deep beneath their feet, Khafre's creation endured, dreaming. The air trapped within its chambered base was dry and still, heavy with the scent of ancient limestone. If a man had stood there, he might have sworn he heard a faint heartbeat, not of life, but of time itself. Centuries later, when the desert grew restless again, sand shifted after a great storm, uncovering part of the Sphinx's head. Nomads passing through saw eyes of stone staring at them from the dunes. They fled in terror, believing it an omen. "The lion god has awakened," they whispered in the markets of Cairo. The tale spread like wind through palm groves and along the river. Scholars scoffed, but others were drawn by curiosity. A few brave souls travelled to the plateau to see for themselves. They found the face half buried, calm and unblinking, watching the horizon as it had 4,000 years before. One of them knelt and brushed sand from the stone cheek. Beneath his fingers he felt warmth, not from the sun but from the stone itself, as if it still held the breath of its maker. The man bowed his head without knowing why. "Whoever you are," he said softly, "you are not gone." The Sphinx remained silent, but the desert wind rose, swirling around the plateau with the sound of distant chanting. Perhaps it was only the echo of history, or perhaps the spirit of Khafre was stirring again, aware of eyes upon him after so many forgotten lifetimes. The dunes trembled slightly, and then grew still. The man turned and walked away, never realizing that the wind had carried his words deep into the stone, a reminder to a sleeping king that he was indeed remembered. Ages turned, and once more the Sphinx rose to meet the world. The century was young when a pharaoh named Thutmose came hunting near Giza. The air shimmered with heat, and his soldiers rested in the shade of the dunes. The prince, weary from the sun, lay down beside a mound of sand and dreamed. In his sleep, a great figure appeared before him, half man, half lion, its face radiant with gold. The voice that spoke was not thunderous, but calm, echoing like wind through hollow stone. "Look upon me, Thutmose, son of Egypt," it said. "I am your protector. I have watched while sand buried my body and silence stole my name. Clear the sand from me, and I shall make you king." The prince awoke, trembling beneath the noonday sun. Around him, the wind had shifted, revealing part of a colossal head staring from the sand. Thutmose ordered his men to dig. For days they laboured, uncovering the Sphinx's neck, shoulders, and the curve of its massive paws. When the full face emerged, he fell to his knees. The monument's expression was unchanged, serene, eternal, patient. It seemed to regard him not as a stranger, but as a returning friend. He fulfilled the promise made in his dream, clearing the sand and building a shrine between its paws. On a red granite stele he recorded the vision. The Sphinx spoke to me, saying, "I give you kingship." His prophecy came true. Thutmose ascended the throne soon after, and the legend of the dream stele was born. The priests rejoiced, proclaiming that Khafre's guardian had awakened at last. They restored rituals at the site, lighting incense and singing hymns long forgotten. Pilgrims returned from every corner of Egypt, carrying offerings of gold, grain, and oil. Once again, the Sphinx became a living god, and Thutmose, the Dreamer King, was called its chosen son. Under his reign, artists repaired the cracks in the stone, priests chanted the old words of Ra, and the sands were pushed back. The plateau breathed again, yet the desert is patient. When Thutmose died, the dunes crept forward once more. The Sphinx, though free for a generation, would sleep again, half buried, half awake. But now it was different. The story of its voice had spread far and wide, carried by priests and travellers, by merchants and storytellers. The memory of Khafre's creation was reborn, no longer history, but myth. The Sphinx had become eternal in another way, not through stone alone, but through story. Centuries later, when new empires rose and foreign tongues echoed through Egypt's temples, the Sphinx remained. Soldiers camped near it, philosophers studied its silence, and poets described it as a riddle carved by gods. They did not know Khafre's name, but they felt his presence. The wind still carried the same hum at dusk, the same low voice that had once spoken to a prince, and though sand would bury it again and again, it no longer slept alone, for it now lived within the dreams of men. The Sphinx endured through invasions, through the rise of new gods and foreign tongues. Greek travellers came and marvelled, calling it the guardian of mysteries. They gave it a new name, Sphinx, meaning the strangler, for to them its silence was a riddle that could choke the mind. They believed it guarded hidden wisdom, some lost truth of the world's beginning. The priests of later dynasties, seeking favour with new rulers, blended the old and the new. They said the Sphinx was the form of Harmaches, Horus on the horizon, yet also a vessel for foreign gods. But the monument itself did not change. It simply watched, patient as the stars above. During the rule of the Ptolemies, scholars measured its proportions and wrote of its strange perfection. Its eyes, they said, are not made for looking but for remembering. Philosophers from Greece and Rome stood before it, each finding in its face whatever they sought: wisdom, terror, eternity. One poet claimed that the Sphinx whispered to him at sunset, "All empires end, but I remain." None knew if he had imagined it or not. The legend spread nonetheless. As centuries passed, the great structures of Giza became less monuments and more mysteries. The pyramids were stripped of their shining limestone, the temples eroded, but the Sphinx still bore its unblinking gaze. Sand buried it to its neck once more. Nomads lit fires near its chin, unaware that their warmth touched a king's dream. Priests of later cults built shrines to their own gods beside it, believing its presence brought power. Others avoided it entirely, fearing it watched those who lied. Whatever they believed, the Sphinx listened. The wind carved fine lines into its face, but beneath the erosion there was a strange sense of endurance, as if the stone itself remembered the rhythm of the pharaoh's breath. Roman soldiers, stationed nearby, carved their names into its pores. Traders resting in its shadow at dusk swore they heard faint music when the wind blew from the south. Even conquerors paused before it, sensing something greater than empire. "Who made this?" they asked. The locals shrugged. It was here before memory. They were right in more ways than they knew. Through all the changes, wars, plagues, and the fall of dynasties, the Sphinx remained, half buried, half revealed, like a thought the world could never fully forget. Every few centuries men would dig it out again, clean its body, repair its cracks, only for time to reclaim it. Yet each rediscovery renewed the myth. Each unveiling made it live again. And through it all, the essence of Khafre endured. His pyramid still caught the morning light, and his face, though weathered, still gazed toward the sunrise. The stone did not speak, but it no longer needed to. Its silence had become the language of eternity, the same calm that Khafre once carried within himself. In every age, those who stood before the Sphinx felt it, the quiet certainty that some truths do not fade. They only wait, carved into the bones of the earth, patient as gods, infinite as time. The centuries rolled on like the tide of the Nile, washing away memories even as they left traces behind. The name of Khafre, once sung in the temples of Ra, faded into confusion. Some called him Chephren, others Cheops the Younger, and others still did not speak his name at all. He became a shadow behind his own monuments, the invisible mind that had given form to eternity. Scholars in far lands speculated about who had built the Great Pyramid beside the Sphinx, but the answer slipped further from truth with each retelling. The world remembered the wonders, but not the man, and yet, perhaps that was fitting. Khafre had never sought glory for himself. He had sought balance. Even in forgetting, his wish was granted. The monuments endured while his ego dissolved into sand. Travellers from distant empires came to Giza and wondered at the scale of what they saw. Greek philosophers called the Sphinx a guardian of cosmic truth. Roman poets described it as a door between worlds. Later, when the empire of the Caesars fell and the world entered shadow, the desert reclaimed everything once more. The wind whispered through the empty causeway, smoothing the edges of broken temples. The Sphinx, half buried again, became nameless. Children of the desert tribes played near its head, throwing stones at the unblinking eyes, unaware that they mocked a god. Still, there were moments when the old presence stirred. During storms, lightning flashed across the plateau, and for an instant the Sphinx appeared alive, its face glowing against the darkness, its shadow stretching for miles. Those who witnessed it fell silent. They did not know the name Khafre, but they felt awe all the same. The memory of his spirit remained not in words, but in the shape of the stone, in the order it imposed upon the horizon. The soul of the Pharaoh still watched through that gaze, unbroken by the passing of language or time. In monasteries and foreign courts, rumours of a sleeping giant beneath the sands spread anew. Scholars drew sketches from second-hand tales. Some believed it hid treasure, others divine wisdom. None guessed that what it guarded was not gold or knowledge, but a promise that balance would return whenever the world forgot how to keep it. When the first explorers of later ages began to study the ruins of Egypt, they stood before the Sphinx, puzzled. "Who made this?" they asked their guides. "A forgotten king," came the answer. The explorers nodded, yet when they looked into the stone eyes they felt something deeper, a recognition, like seeing an old friend they could not name. They sensed the weight of millennia pressing upon them, the hum of life and death intertwined. It was not history they felt, but presence. The desert wind swept around them, the same wind that had carried Khafre's voice through the ages. It whispered softly through the broken temples and over the dunes, as though the land itself was trying to remember a word it once knew, a name carved in light, buried beneath eternity. And for a moment, as the sun rose and the Sphinx's face caught fire with dawn, the forgotten name seemed to echo once more across the sands. The modern age arrived with noise, machines, and hunger for discovery. Explorers from across the world returned to Giza, armed not with prayers but with tools and sketches, seeking to measure what the ancients had left behind. The desert, startled from centuries of sleep, revealed its secrets slowly. The Sphinx, still buried up to its neck, emerged once more under the hands of diggers who did not yet understand what they were uncovering. The year was young, and the world was changing, but the stone remained the same. Beneath layers of sand lay the memory of a civilization that had spoken to stars. When the final dunes were cleared, and the Sphinx stood once again in full view, people gasped. It was larger than anyone had imagined, its paws stretching like waves of rock, its face scarred yet serene. Cameras flashed, notebooks filled, and voices in dozens of languages echoed where once only wind had spoken. Yet amid the clamour, there was silence. the kind that falls when humans stand before something older than their understanding. Scholars argued endlessly. Some insisted it was the work of Khafre, others claimed it predated him by millennia. The debates filled lecture halls and books, but the monument did not answer. It simply watched, as it always had, unbothered by theories or time. The Sphinx had outlasted priests, emperors, conquerors, and now it would outlast historians. It didn't need them to name it. It knew itself. The wind still moved through its cracks with the same steady sigh it had carried in the days of the pharaohs. The light of sunrise still touched its brow in perfect alignment, as if obeying a promise set in place 4,000 years before. Visitors who came at dawn felt something stir within them. Not fear, not awe, but recognition. The shadow of the Sphinx stretched long across the plateau, reaching toward the pyramid of Khafre. The connection between them was visible even to those who did not know the story. The line of light that linked their forms seemed alive, as if some invisible bond still held earth and sky together. Archaeologists uncovered fragments of old temples, inscriptions bearing half-erased names. Among them they found one that spoke clearly: Khafre, beloved of Ra, eternal in the horizon. It was small, barely visible, but it was enough. The forgotten name had returned to the lips of men. The scholars recorded it carefully, unaware that they were fulfilling a circle, rediscovering what the desert had guarded for millennia. At sunset, when the day's dust settled, the workers would sit near the Sphinx and rest. Some said they heard a faint vibration beneath the stone like a low hum. They called it imagination, the result of heat and exhaustion. But others listened closer. It was steady, rhythmic, the heartbeat of the desert itself, and if one stood perfectly still, it seemed to echo a single breath, calm, endless, and familiar, as though the spirit of Khafre still lived within the stone, content at last to be seen again. The Sphinx stands today exactly where Khafre first dreamed it, carved from the living rock of Giza, facing the rising sun as though guarding the promise of every dawn. Around it, the world has changed beyond imagining. Cars hum where chariots once rolled, city lights outshine the stars that once guided priests, and voices from every language drift through the hot air. Yet the monument endures, unmoved, its gaze fixed on the horizon that still glows with the same golden fire that warmed the pharaoh's face thousands of years ago. Time has turned the desert into a museum of silence, but the Sphinx remains alive in a way no human ever could, a heartbeat of stone. Tourists gather by the thousands, snapping photographs, whispering myths. Guides speak of riddles, of gods and kings, of builders whose names are lost. Some point to the pyramid beside it and tell of Khafre, the son of Khufu, the dreamer of balance, the man who believed eternity could be carved. Most listen politely and move on, unaware that the air they breathe carries the dust of his kingdom, that the ground beneath them still hums with the rhythm of his order. The sands shift, but the geometry remains. The plateau is still aligned with the heavens, as if the hands that built it had never left. At sunrise, the first light slides across the pyramid's edge and touches the Sphinx's face, just as it did in Khafre's time. The same moment that once marked the renewal of Egypt now belongs to all humankind. Scholars may debate, pilgrims may pray, children may climb the walls of nearby villages to glimpse it, yet none can change what it is. The Sphinx is not a monument to power or conquest. It is a mirror. It reflects the gaze of whoever stands before it. To the proud it speaks of humility, to the weary of patience, to the curious of wonder, and to those who still believe in order amid chaos, it whispers the same truth Khafre once carried in his heart, that harmony endures when men remember to listen. The wind continues to circle the plateau, brushing against stone older than empires. At dusk, the shadow of the Sphinx stretches once more toward Khafre's pyramid, as it has for 45 centuries, a line between man and eternity. In that moment, the desert grows quiet, and the sun dips beneath the edge of the world. The last light rests on the Guardian's brow, and for an instant it almost seems to breathe. Perhaps it does. Perhaps within that silence the soul of the Pharaoh still lingers, not to rule, but simply to watch. Night returns, and the stars rise above Giza, tracing their ancient paths across the sky. The pyramids glow faintly in the moonlight. The Sphinx gazes east, waiting for morning. And when dawn comes again, spilling gold across the sand, it is as if time itself begins anew. The same light, the same gaze, the same unbroken promise that Khafre once made to the world, that nothing truly sacred is ever lost, and that even in stillness, creation continues forever.